In a mansion filled with luxury, a man in his prime seemed to have everything: wealth, power, and influence. However, in a cruel twist of fate, he found himself trapped in a deep coma. For 5 years, no one knew who he was, but a humble and dedicated nurse spent every day by his side. Unaware of his true identity, she would tell him ancient stories, legends from long ago, imagining that her words would never reach his ears. But he, lying there in silence, was hearing everything you are about to embark on a journey of discovery, love, and overcoming obstacles. If you enjoy stories that touch the heart and reveal the true essence of life, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Let's begin this journey together. The mansion, made of glass and marble, glimmered under the city lights like a beacon of opulence. Inside, the soft sound of classical music filled the air, blending with the elegant murmur of conversations from the successful people gathered there. It was a cold winter night in New York, but inside the house the temperature always felt just right. The elegant Persian rug that covered the floor of the main hall added a touch of warmth, contrasting with the cool tones of the glass walls. Around the large dining table, guests from all sectors of society were enjoying themselves. Businessmen, artists, and influential figures of the upper class were present at a gala event hosted by the man of the house himself. He, a magnate with large investments, was at the peak of his career. His life was an exhibition of success, luxurious dinners, international trips, and fame that seemed unattainable. However, one night, something unexpected happened. It was the height of the party. The lights flickered momentarily, as if part of a grand trick, and when they came back on, a scream pierced the room. The man, 40 years old, and in the full vigor of his health, suddenly collapsed into a deep coma. No one knew how or why. The doctors who were called in couldn't explain the cause, only confirming that he was in a vegetative state with no signs of consciousness or active brain function. The months that followed were a whirlwind of uncertainty and dashed hopes. His family, concerned, hoped for a miracle that never came. But among the nurses who cared for him, there was one woman who stood out. She didn't belong to the luxurious, distant circle that surrounded the millionaire. Her name was Clara. Clara was a simple woman from humble beginnings, with a heart that overflowed with compassion. She had a gift for touching people's souls with her kindness, and perhaps that was why she was always assigned to the most difficult cases, like Marco's, the millionaire in a coma. Clara spent hours by Marco's side, holding his hand, speaking to him, and often reading ancient legends that she herself cherished. She believed stories had the power to bring healing even to the most worn-out hearts. At first, she spoke to him with a gentle, almost poetic tone. Like a child telling a bedtime story, Clara recited tales of long-forgotten times, where heroes and heroines faced great challenges. She spoke of kings and queens, distant lands, and ancient civilizations where love and courage were stronger than any adversity. Clara believed these words somehow echoed in Marco's mind, but she had no idea who he truly was. To her, he was just a man in a coma, lost in the silence of a world he could no longer reach. Despite this, Clara didn't allow herself to become disillusioned. Every day, she continued to sit by Marco's side, speaking to him as if he could hear her, as if the stories had the power to reach him, even though he could not respond. The other caregivers, more pragmatic and distant, laughed at her, thinking she was clinging to illusions. But Clara didn't mind. To her, there was no difference between the rich and the poor when it came to human care. The man in a coma needed her just as much as anyone, else perhaps even more. She was there for him, regardless of his condition or the fact that he could never thank her or even speak a word. At night, after a long shift, Clara would retreat to her small apartment, a modest space that barely had furniture but was enough for her to feel comfortable. However, her thoughts were always with Marco. She didn't see him as a rich or important man. To her, he was simply someone in pain, someone she wanted to comfort. She did everything she could to bring him out of the silent darkness of his coma, offering him in some way a piece of light through her stories. But there was something Clara didn't know. Marco, in complete silence, heard every word she spoke. He couldn't respond, but his senses were alive, and his mind, more awake than anyone could imagine, kept every one of the stories she told. He knew every detail of her voice, every nuance of her soft tone, and over the years, something had formed inside him, an inexplicable bond, a deep affection for Clara, even though he had never seen her with his eyes. It was as if he had fallen in love without knowing who she truly was, simply feeling the purity of her presence in her words. And while Clara believed he would never hear her, Marco, in his silent prison, waited for the right moment to reveal what his heart had discovered. The woman who told him stories was, in some way, more important to him than anything he had ever had before in his life of wealth and luxury. Clara, after so much time caring for Marco, was beginning to feel a change in her own heart. Something in her spirit was transforming. She knew Marco's story wouldn't end there, but she had no idea that her own life, her own story, was about to be turned upside down. Clara sat by the window, the cold breeze brushing against her face as the sun began to rise. It was an ordinary morning, just like any other, yet something in the air felt different, like a shift was quietly unfolding. The hospital room, once filled with a cold, sterile emptiness, now felt strangely alive, even with Marco still lying in his bed, unmoving. The faint sound of the ventilator and the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor were the only signs of life in the room. She had grown so accustomed to these sounds over the years, but today they felt louder, more present, almost as if they were awaiting something to happen. Clara's fingers lightly traced the edge of Marco's hand, the warmth of his skin almost bringing a sense of reassurance. It had been 5 years, 5 long years of telling him stories, of talking to him as if he could hear every word, even though no response ever came. She had no idea who he was or what his life had been like before this inexplicable coma. But she had created an unspoken bond with him, one that felt stronger than anything she had ever known. The door opened quietly and a nurse stepped in, her voice soft but clear. "Clara, you should take a break. You've been here all night." Clara glanced up, her eyes tired but determined. "I'm fine. I'm staying here." The nurse hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, understanding the depth of Clara's devotion. She had seen it in her before. "I'll bring you some coffee then," she said gently, leaving the room. The silence returned, but now it felt different. Clara could feel her heart beating a little faster, an unease bubbling beneath the surface. She had no logical explanation for the sudden sense of anticipation in the room. Something was about to change. She didn't know how or why, but she couldn't shake the feeling. It was just then that she noticed a subtle movement, a twitch of Marco's finger. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she thought it was just a trick of her imagination. But then it happened again, a slight movement, as if his body were waking from a long, deep slumber. Her heart pounded in her chest. She leaned closer to him, her voice barely a whisper. "Marco?" she said softly, her hand gently holding his. "Can you hear me?" For a moment, there was nothing, no sign, no indication that he was aware of her presence. Clara felt her hope begin to falter, but just as quickly as it began to fade, Marco's eyes fluttered. Slowly, almost painfully, his eyelids parted, revealing eyes that were wide with confusion, yet deeply aware, as if they had been searching for something in the dark. Clara's breath hitched. She had never seen him like this, never thought this day would come. She squeezed his hand tighter, her voice trembling. "Marco, can you hear me? It's Clara. You've been in a coma for so long. We've all been waiting for you to wake up." Marco blinked a few times, his eyes struggling to focus on her. His lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, his gaze seemed to search for something in her face, as if he recognized her, but couldn't quite place her. Clara's mind raced. Was this really happening? After all this time, after all the stories she'd told him, was he finally waking up? She didn't know what to feel. Relief, joy, confusion. It was all too much, too sudden. "Marco," she whispered again, her voice cracking with emotion. "You're awake. You're finally awake." For a moment, there was only silence, a heavy, weighty silence that stretched between them. Clara held his hand, her pulse racing. She wasn't sure what to do next, how to explain everything that had happened in the years he had been unconscious, how to bridge the gap between the man she had heard so much about in her stories and the man who lay before her, vulnerable and unsure. Slowly, Marco's lips parted again, and this time a sound escaped, a hoarse, barely audible whisper. "Clara." The word was like a spark, igniting something deep within her. She squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with emotion. "Yes, Marco, it's me. I've been here all this time. I've been telling you stories, hoping you could hear me." He blinked again, his eyes seeming to search her face, trying to remember, trying to understand. But then, slowly, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "I remember," he rasped, his voice low and rough, like a man who had been silent for far too long. "I remember your voice, your stories." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "You do?" Marco's eyes softened as he looked at her, his gaze more focused now, more alert. "Yes, every word, every story." He paused, his expression becoming more serious. "I've been listening all along." Clara felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected this. She had spent 5 years speaking to him, telling him stories of old legends, and now, hearing him speak, hearing him remember, everything she had believed in, every hope she had held on to, felt more real than ever. But then, something in his eyes shifted. There was a depth there, a weight that she couldn't fully understand. He looked at her with a sort of gratitude, but there was something else, something that felt almost like a confession. "Clara," Marco began, his voice stronger now, but still carrying a faint rasp. "There's something I need to tell you." Clara tilted her head, her brow furrowing. "What is it, Marco?" He paused for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, and then his gaze softened. "I'm not just anyone. I'm not the man you think I am." Clara's heart skipped, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" Marco took a slow, deep breath, as if the truth was too much for him to bear. "I'm a millionaire. I've been a billionaire. The man you've been talking to. I've been him all along. I've been listening to your stories, Clara, all these years. I've been with you, even when I couldn't speak." Clara's breath caught in her throat. A flood of emotions rushed over her, but the most dominant one was confusion. She stared at him, trying to process the words he had just spoken. He was a billionaire, a man with everything, someone she could never have imagined. "But why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you—" Clara began, but her voice trailed off, lost in the magnitude of the revelation. Marco's eyes held hers with an intensity that shook her to the core. "Because I needed to hear your stories. I needed to feel the kindness in your voice, the warmth you gave me when I had nothing, when I was lost." Clara's mind was spinning. The man she had spent 5 years caring for, the man she had shared her heart with through her stories, was someone entirely different from what she had imagined. And yet, the connection between them felt undeniable, stronger than anything wealth or status could offer. "I've been here," Marco said quietly, his gaze never leaving hers, "and I've been waiting for the moment I could finally tell you what I really feel." Clara stood there, her breath catching in her chest as the words hung in the air between them. Marco's revelation echoed in her mind like a drumbeat, each pulse reverberating through her thoughts, pushing her into a whirlpool of confusion. The man she had been talking to for 5 years, every story, every word, was not who she thought he was. He was someone else entirely, a billionaire, a man whose life was so far removed from her own that it felt like an impossible divide. But yet, as she stared at him, something inside her resisted the logic of wealth, of status, and of the world he had once inhabited. What did it matter now? It didn't change what she had shared with him over those years. Her hands, still holding his, trembled slightly. She had spoken to him as though he were an ordinary man, not someone with unimaginable riches and a life of grandeur. And in a way, that's exactly what he had been, at least to her. A man who needed stories to hold on to, who needed her words to fill the silence that had consumed him. Marco's eyes were filled with a mix of vulnerability and regret, but there was also something deeper there, something more profound that reached out to her from within the depths of his coma-induced isolation. He had been awake in some way, listening, feeling, learning from her. "I didn't want you to think of me as a millionaire," Marco said softly, his voice still raspy but growing stronger by the second. "I didn't want you to see me for what I was, Clara. I wanted you to see me for who I could be, who I wanted to be, the man who needed your kindness, your stories, your voice." Clara swallowed, unsure of how to respond. Part of her wanted to laugh, to cry, to scream at the absurdity of it all. But most of all, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief that Marco was awake, that he was finally with her in a way she had never imagined. But there was also the creeping uncertainty of what would come next. Would this change everything? Would their connection remain as strong now that the truth had come to light? "You've been listening to me all this time?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She could hardly fathom it. The idea that every story, every word she had spoken to him had somehow reached him. She had no idea if he had been able to feel her presence the way she had felt his, but now, with him awake and looking at her with such intensity, it seemed impossible to ignore the bond that had formed between them. Marco nodded, a faint, bittersweet smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Yes, I heard everything. Every word, every legend, every quiet moment. When you told me those stories, it felt like I was being pulled out of darkness. I couldn't speak, couldn't show you that I was here, but I was. I was listening." Clara's heart ached. The man in front of her, the man who had been so far removed from her world, had been struggling with his own isolation, just as she had been. They had both been prisoners, he in his coma, and she in her solitude, caring for a man who couldn't return her feelings, who couldn't even acknowledge her presence. And yet, in the most unlikely way, they had found each other. "Why didn't you say something before?" Clara asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Why didn't you tell me who you were? Why make me feel like I was just a nurse to you?" Marco closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to answer. "Because I didn't want to be defined by what I had. I didn't want you to treat me differently because of my wealth. I didn't want you to see me as just some billionaire who could give you everything. I wanted you to see me as a person, Clara. Someone who was lost, someone who needed your stories, your heart. And that's what I got, even though I could never show you." Clara's thoughts were a jumble. His words made sense in a way. She had never seen him as anything more than a man in need of care, and in that sense, she had never treated him with the expectations others might have. He had been human to her, even when he was incapable of reciprocating. She had never been interested in his money or his status. To her, it was always about the simple act of helping, of being there for someone who couldn't ask for it. But now, as Marco lay before her, awake and with his full identity revealed, Clara felt a wave of uncertainty flood her. The world she knew was a world of simplicity. She was a nurse, he was a patient, and there was no room for anything more, or so she had believed. But now, things had changed. His presence was no longer just about healing him, no longer just about the stories. He was awake, and with his awakening came an entirely new set of questions. "What happens now?" Clara asked softly, the weight of the question heavy in the room. Marco's gaze softened, and he reached out with his free hand, brushing a strand of hair from her face in a gesture that felt almost surreal. "What happens now is up to you," he said quietly. "I don't expect anything, Clara. I don't expect you to feel differently about me because of who I am. But I want you to know that I'm here, and I'm real. I've heard you. I've always heard you." The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't. The kind of silence that had once separated them. It was different now, charged with something new, something unspoken, yet understood. Clara didn't know what to say. She didn't know what to do with the new reality before her. But in that moment, as she looked into Marco's eyes, she understood one thing clearly. He wasn't just the man in the bed, the man who had been a patient in her care for 5 long years. He was a man who had listened, who had been changed by her words, just as she had been. unknowingly changed by his presence. And despite the difference in their lives, despite the vast chasm between the world he had come from and the world she inhabited, there was something between them that could not be denied. It was real, and that was enough for now. Days had passed since Marco's awakening, but Clara still found herself unable to fully process the whirlwind of emotions that had swept over her. Each time she entered his room, her mind was flooded with a mix of wonder and confusion. It was as if she were living in two worlds at once. The world of Marco, the man who had been in a coma for 5 years, and Marco, the billionaire with a past she knew nothing about. He had tried to make her feel comfortable, to assure her that everything was fine, that he didn't expect anything from her. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that things had irrevocably changed. How could they not? The man she had cared for, the man she had shared so many stories with, was no longer just a faceless patient in a bed. He was someone she had built a connection with, a connection that was now overshadowed by the weight of his identity. And yet, as Clara sat in his room, listening to him speak of the past, she began to understand that he was just as lost as she had been. Marco hadn't just been asleep for 5 years, he had been shut out from the world, unable to move, to speak, to connect. He had lived in a kind of isolation so deep that even his own wealth had seemed to mean nothing. Now that he was awake, the walls between them felt insurmountable. "I was a different person when I went into that coma," Marco said one afternoon, his voice quiet, as if he were unsure of how to approach the subject. "I wasn't always like this. I wasn't always so detached." Clara looked at him, her brow furrowed. She had heard pieces of his story, but she hadn't heard it all. "What do you mean?" He shifted slightly in the bed, his gaze wandering to the window where the light filtered through the blinds in soft golden streams. "I was caught up in my own world, Clara. I was driven by ambition, by the need to prove myself. My family, my father especially, pushed me to be someone I wasn't. I never had the chance to just breathe, to just live for myself." Clara listened, intrigued yet cautious. She knew little about his family, about the life he had led before the accident. It was hard to imagine him as anything other than the man who had been lying in that hospital bed for the past 5 years. "When I was younger," Marco continued, "I was reckless. I made choices that hurt the people I cared about, the people who mattered most. I focused too much on the idea of success, on being the best, the most powerful, and it cost me." Clara's heart tightened as she listened to the pain in his voice. There was something about his vulnerability, the way he spoke of his past mistakes, that made her understand him more than she had before. He wasn't just the arrogant, powerful man she might have imagined. He was someone who had been shaped by the weight of expectations, by the demands of a life that didn't allow him to be who he truly wanted to be. "I thought I had it all," Marco said with a soft laugh, as if the irony of his words were just now hitting him. "Money, power, influence, but I was empty inside. I couldn't even see it at the time. It wasn't until I was lying there, in that coma, that I understood. The things I thought mattered, they didn't. They never did." Clara looked at him, her heart breaking for him in a way she hadn't expected. She had always seen him as a patient, someone in need of care. But now, seeing him as a man who had lived through his own struggles, his own regrets, changed everything. "You didn't know if you'd ever wake up," Clara said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "How did you deal with it? Being trapped like that?" Marco's eyes darkened, the weight of the question heavy on his shoulders. "It was hell," he said softly. "I had nothing but my thoughts, my regrets. I couldn't change anything. I couldn't fix the things I had broken. And I knew that if I ever woke up, I would have to face the consequences. But there was something else too. Something that kept me going." Clara leaned forward slightly, her curiosity piqued. "What was it?" Marco's gaze softened as he looked at her. "You," he said simply. "Your voice, your stories. I couldn't see you, but I could hear you. And somehow that made me feel less alone. You were the only thing that made sense to me. And when I woke up, I knew I had to make things right, but not just with the people from my past, with myself. And with you. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure how to respond to his words. She had never imagined that her simple, everyday act of speaking to him, telling him stories to fill the silence, could have had such an impact on him. It seemed so insignificant compared to the weight of his past, compared to everything he had endured in his coma. But in that moment, Clara realized just how powerful her words had been, not just for him, but for her as well. "You've been through so much," Clara said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "But you're awake now. You have a chance to start over. You don't have to keep carrying the weight of your past." Marco nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Starting over isn't as easy as it sounds. There's too much to make up for. Too many mistakes I can never undo. Clara reached out and gently took his hand in hers, her touch warm and reassuring. "Maybe you can't undo everything, but you can start by being the person you want to be, the man you want to become. And you don't have to do it alone." Marco's eyes softened as he looked at her. For a moment there was only silence, heavy but comforting. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, a shared understanding between two people who had been through their own struggles, their own battles, and had somehow found a way to connect. And in that moment, Clara realized that the man who had been in a coma for 5 years, the man who had seemed so unreachable, was more real to her than anyone she had ever known. Not because of his wealth or his status, but because of his humanity, because of the vulnerability that had been hidden beneath the surface, waiting for someone to hear it. The days that followed Marco's awakening felt like a blur, yet at the same time, they stretched on endlessly. Clara had been by his side constantly, guiding him through the process of regaining strength, offering him reassurance, and slowly helping him adjust to the world he had been shut out from for so long. She didn't know how to balance the newfound revelations of his past and his current reality. It was a delicate dance between being his caretaker, his confidant, and the woman he seemed to need more than anyone else. Despite his wealth, Marco was forced to rebuild his life from the ground up. His body was weak, and his mind was exhausted from years of confinement. But the most difficult part was the emotional burden he carried, the guilt, the regret for the life he had led before his coma, and the painful realization that he had wasted so much time focusing on the wrong things. But with Clara by his side, he had begun to see the possibility of something different, something more meaningful than his past existence could have ever offered. One morning, as Clara helped Marco sit up in his bed, the sunlight filtering through the windows, Marco's gaze seemed distant, lost in thought. He was still regaining his strength, his movements slow and deliberate, but today there was something else in his eyes, a fire, a spark of purpose that hadn't been there before. "Clara," he said softly, his voice still rough but steady. "I've been thinking." Clara turned her attention to him, her hands gently supporting his back as she adjusted the pillows behind him. "What about?" she asked, giving him a soft smile. "About what you said, about starting over." Marco's eyes met hers with an intensity that caught her off guard. "I don't want to waste any more time, Clara. I know I can't undo my past, but I can change my future, and I want you to be a part of that." Clara's heart fluttered. She had never expected him to say something like that. For so long, she had only seen him as a man in a coma, unable to even acknowledge the possibility of something more. And now, here he was, speaking as if he truly understood the weight of his choices, as if he were finally ready to live for something beyond wealth and status. "I'm not sure what that looks like yet," Marco continued, "but I know I don't want to go back to the life I had. I don't want to live in the shadow of my father's expectations or my own mistakes. I want to find something real, something that matters, and I think it's you, Clara." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had known there was something between them, something undeniable, but hearing him say it out loud made everything feel more real. Her heart raced as she tried to process what he was telling her. I don't know what to say," Clara admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I've spent so much time just helping you, caring for you. I never thought you could feel this way about me." Marco gave her a small, reassuring smile, his eyes softening with understanding. "I don't expect anything from you, Clara. I just want you to know that I'm here. I'm here for the first time in my life, truly here, and I want to see where this goes. With you, I want to build something with you." Clara didn't know how to respond. She had never allowed herself to think beyond the role she had taken on: nurse, caretaker, listener. She had never thought of herself as more than someone who was just passing through his life. But now, with the walls between them crumbling, she could no longer ignore the connection they had shared all these years. "Marco," she whispered, unsure of how to put the emotions swirling inside her into words. "I don't know if I'm ready for all of this. Everything has changed so suddenly." "I know," Marco said softly, "and I don't want to rush you. I just want you to know that whatever happens, I'm here. I'm not the man I used to be, and I want to take my time learning who I can be with you, without the weight of the past hanging over us." Clara sat quietly for a moment, her hand still resting on his. The air in the room seemed to thicken with the enormity of his words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that the connection they shared was real, but there was still so much uncertainty. Could they truly build something new from the ashes of the life he had left behind? Could they move past the differences in their worlds, her humble existence and his life of luxury and power? And yet, as she looked into Marco's eyes, she saw a man who was willing to start fresh, to leave behind everything that had once defined him, and to build a future based on something simpler, something more genuine. "Maybe we can take it slow," Clara said finally, her voice soft but steady. "Maybe we can figure this out together." Marco's eyes lit up, a mixture of relief and joy flooding his expression. "I'd like that, more than anything." The following weeks brought a quiet kind of peace to Marco and Clara's days. Marco, still regaining his strength, began to slowly re-enter the world, facing the responsibilities of his business, of his family, and of himself. But now, he was doing so with a different mindset. No longer was he consumed by ambition and success. Instead, he sought meaning in the small things, things he had overlooked before, like kindness, like connection, like love. Clara, too, began to find a new sense of purpose. She had always been driven by a desire to help others, but now, with Marco in her life, she began to think about her own dreams, about what she wanted beyond caring for others. The boundaries that had once defined her life began to blur, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to consider a future where she could have more than just a simple existence. One evening, as the two of them sat on the balcony of Marco's apartment, the city lights twinkling below, Clara turned to him and smiled. "You know," she said softly, "I think we're both learning to live again." Marco looked at her, his eyes full of warmth. Together, for the first time, Clara allowed herself to believe it, to believe in the possibility of a new beginning. The days passed in a blur of new experiences for both Marco and Clara. They were each navigating a path that neither had expected, and though the future was uncertain, it felt like a chapter had begun for them, one they were writing together day by day. But, as much as they both tried to focus on the present and the bond they were slowly building, the shadows of the past had a way of creeping back in, reminding them of the lives they had once led. For Marco, it wasn't just his health that he had to rebuild. His entire identity had been shaped by a world that now seemed foreign to him. As he started to step back into his role in the business world, he realized how disconnected he had become from the person he used to be, the man who had been driven by power, wealth, and the expectations of his family. His father's voice still echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of what was expected of him. Clara had noticed the subtle changes in Marco as he began to re-engage with his business and his family. He would come home after long days, his face tired, his eyes clouded with doubt. He had spent so many years chasing success, only to realize in the silence of his coma that none of it had brought him peace. Now, as he tried to navigate this new version of himself, the pressure of his past weighed on him more than he had anticipated. One evening, as Clara sat across from Marco at dinner, she could see the tension in his posture. He wasn't the same carefree man she had seen in those first days after waking. He was still struggling, still grappling with what he was supposed to be, and she couldn't help but wonder if the past was going to haunt him forever. "Marco," she said softly, her voice breaking the comfortable silence between them. "You've been quiet lately. What's going on?" Marco looked up, his hand pausing mid-air as he reached for his wine glass. He seemed to hesitate, his eyes flicking to hers and then down to the table again. "It's just complicated," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "I've been back in the office more, and there's so much I have to untangle. My father, he's been pressuring me to take over everything again, and I'm not sure I want to anymore." Clara set her fork down and leaned forward, her eyes filled with concern. "What do you mean? You don't have to go back to that life, Marco. You've made it clear that you want something different." "I know," Marco said with a sigh, his fingers running through his hair. "But it's not that easy. I built everything with my father, Clara. All those businesses, all that success. It's what I was raised to do. It's who I was meant to be. And now I'm trying to figure out who I am without all of that. It's harder than I thought." Clara reached out, her hand gently resting on his. "You don't have to be who your father wanted you to be. You don't have to carry that weight. You've already made the hardest decision by waking up and choosing to live for yourself. The rest, that's just noise." Marco looked at her, his eyes searching hers as though he was trying to find the answer in her gaze. "But I've spent so many years trying to be someone I'm not. I don't know how to just let go. Letting go means cutting ties with everything I've known, and I'm not sure I can do that." Clara smiled softly, squeezing his hand. "Letting go doesn't mean you forget about the past. It means you stop letting it control you. You have a choice now, Marco. You don't have to be stuck in a role you never wanted. You can build something new, but only if you let go of the past." For a long moment, Marco was silent, his eyes drifting to the window, looking out over the city that had once been his empire. He knew Clara was right, but the pull of his family's expectations, the weight of his past life, was a constant battle. He had built an identity on the things he had now rejected, and though he was ready to move on, he couldn't help but feel like part of him was still tethered to that world. As the days wore on, Clara noticed Marco becoming more withdrawn. He would spend hours on the phone with his family, making decisions, signing papers, and trying to maintain control over the businesses he had spent so many years cultivating. But with each passing conversation, it became clearer that he was still struggling. The more he tried to keep his grip on his old life, the more distant he seemed from the man he was becoming. One afternoon, after one of Marco's long business meetings, Clara found him sitting on the balcony, staring out at the skyline. He seemed distant, lost in thought, and she knew something was weighing heavily on him. She stepped outside, sitting beside him without saying anything at first. For a long time, they sat together in silence, the city humming quietly beneath them. Finally, Clara spoke. "Marco, it's okay to let go. It's okay to say no." Marco turned to her, his eyes reflecting the turmoil he felt. "But I've spent my whole life saying yes to everything, saying yes to my father, saying yes to expectations. How do I just change that? How do I tell them I don't want this anymore?" Clara reached over, taking his hand in hers. "You don't have to explain yourself to anyone. You've already made the hardest choice. You've chosen to wake up, to live for yourself. Now it's time to choose the life you want, not the one others have planned for you." Marco looked at her, his heart heavy with gratitude. "I don't know if I can do it without disappointing them, without letting everyone down." Clara smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "You won't be letting anyone down. You're just choosing to live your truth, and that's all that matters." For the first time in weeks, Marco felt a glimmer of hope. Clara was right. He didn't have to carry the weight of the past. He didn't have to follow in the footsteps of a life he no longer wanted. He could carve his own path, with her by his side. "I don't know where this will take us," Marco said softly, his hand tightening around hers. "But I know I don't want to do it alone." Clara squeezed his hand in return. "You won't be. I'm here. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." And in that moment, Marco knew he was ready. ready to let go of his past, ready to face the future, and most importantly, ready to create a new life with Clara by his side. The weeks that followed Marco's decision to break away from his father's legacy were some of the most transformative of his life. Every day, he faced the reality of forging a new path, one that was no longer dictated by wealth, power, or expectations. With Clara's support, he began to see the world through different eyes, less concerned with status and more focused on the simplicity of genuine connection. But though Marco had made a monumental choice to start anew, the weight of his past didn't just disappear. It lingered, hovering at the edges of every decision he made. One afternoon, Marco found himself sitting in his office, the same office that had once been a symbol of his power and success. The walls, lined with awards and achievements, now seemed like relics of a past life he no longer wanted to claim. He had come here to finish some business, but now the familiar surroundings only made him feel suffocated, like a prisoner of his own making. As Marco stared out the large windows that overlooked the city, Clara's words echoed in his mind. Let go of the past. You don't have to carry it anymore. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe that he could sever ties with everything that had shaped him. But the truth was, he didn't know how. His family had built this empire. It was in his blood. Letting go of it felt like cutting off a part of himself. Marco, the soft voice broke his reverie, and he turned to see Clara standing in the doorway, a gentle smile on her face. She had been by his side through everything, through his awakening, his recovery, and his attempts to reshape his future. But she knew better than anyone that the emotional toll of change wasn't as simple as it seemed. I thought you were in the kitchen, Marco said, trying to sound casual as he stood up from his desk. Is everything okay? Clara stepped into the room, her gaze soft but steady. I was just wondering if you were all right. You've been here for hours, Marco. I know you're going through a lot, but I don't want you to wear yourself out trying to do everything at once. Marco sighed, walking over to the window again. It's hard. Everything's hard right now. Letting go of all of it, the company, my family's expectations, the life I used to have, it's not as easy as I thought it would be. Clara joined him by the window, standing beside him in silence for a moment. I know it's not easy. You've spent your whole life living in that world. It's not something you can just walk away from overnight. I'm not sure if I can walk away at all, Marco said, his voice quiet, almost to himself. There's so much at stake. My father, my family. If I leave all of this behind, what does that make me? Just another man with no legacy? No purpose? Clara turned to him, her hand gently resting on his arm. No, Marco. What makes you who you are is the choices you make now, not the life you had before. You've already made a huge decision, one that shows you're capable of creating your own path. You don't need to carry that burden anymore. Your purpose can be something you define for yourself, not something that's handed to you. Marco looked down at her, his heart heavy. He had never been so conflicted in his life. He had always been defined by what his family wanted him to be, by the legacy they had created for him. To walk away from that felt like he was abandoning a part of his identity. Yet, deep down, he knew Clara was right. He was no longer the same man who had once cared only about success. He was someone else, someone who wanted more than just wealth and status. But could he truly let go? I want to believe that, Marco said, his voice full of doubt. I want to believe that I can make my own choices, that I can create something real. But there's always that voice in my head telling me I'll be nothing without the empire my family built. Clara took a step closer, her expression filled with understanding. Marco, you have so much more to offer than just the empire. You have the ability to create something from nothing. You've already done that. You're doing it now. But it's not about what you leave behind. It's about what you build going forward. And you don't have to do it alone. You have me. And that's something more valuable than any business deal or family name. Marco's chest tightened as he looked at her. There was truth in her words, something that made the weight of his doubt begin to lighten, if only just slightly. He had never been more aware of how much Clara had become a part of his life, not just as his nurse, but as his partner. She had been the constant presence, the steady force that had helped him rediscover himself after so many years of being lost in the expectations of others. "I don't know where to start," Marco admitted, his voice low. "But I know I don't want to be the man I was." Clara smiled softly, her hand finding his. "You're not that man anymore. You've already started, Marco. You've already chosen something different, and I'll be right here with you, every step of the way." For a moment, Marco allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in a long time: hope. It wasn't a solution, not yet, but it was a beginning, a possibility. He could see now that the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Clara beside him, it didn't seem as daunting as it once had. There were no guarantees, no assurances of success, but for the first time, he felt that the life he was about to build could be his own. "I don't know what the future holds," Marco said softly, "but I'm ready to find out." Clara squeezed his hand, her voice steady. "We'll find it together." The days turned into weeks, and Marco began to embrace his new reality. He no longer spent endless hours in meetings, managing the family empire that had once defined his existence. Instead, he found himself seeking purpose in simpler, more meaningful endeavors. He took long walks with Clara through the city, rediscovering the world outside the confines of high-rise offices and boardroom politics. He began working on personal projects that excited him, things he had always put off for fear of disappointing his family. Clara had always been his anchor, the steady presence that helped him stay grounded. As Marco started to rebuild, she also found herself growing in ways she hadn't anticipated. Being with Marco had brought out a strength in her that she hadn't known she possessed. She had always been driven by compassion, but now she was driven by the possibility of something greater, something that didn't require a title or a paycheck, but something that came from within. One evening, as Marco sat in his new, modest apartment, much smaller than his old penthouse but cozy in its own way, he turned to Clara, who was sitting across from him, reading through a book. The warm glow of the table lamp illuminated her features, casting a soft light on her face. "You know," Marco began, breaking the quiet, "I never realized how much I was missing before. I spent so many years chasing something that was never real. Now even in this small apartment, it feels more real." Clara looked up from her book, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Sometimes it's the simplest things that make life feel full. You don't need all the things you thought you did. You just need the right people. And I think you found that." Marco's eyes softened as he looked at her. "I have. You've been there for me from the very beginning. You've helped me more than I can ever express. You helped me find myself." Again, Clara shook her head slightly, a warm blush rising in her cheeks. "You did the work, Marco. You chose to change. You chose to let go of the things that were holding you back. I was just there to support you." Marco stood up from his chair and walked over to where Clara sat. Kneeling down in front of her, he took both of her hands in his. "You make me want to be a better person. I've been given a second chance at life, and I know that it's because of you. If I hadn't woken up when I did, if I hadn't heard your stories, I would have remained lost forever. You gave me the strength to change." Clara's heart swelled with emotion, and she squeezed his hands, looking into his eyes. "You always had the strength, Marco. You just needed to believe in it. You needed someone who believed in you, and I always have." For a long moment, they simply sat there in silence, the weight of their shared journey hanging in the air. There was so much that had happened between them, so much pain, so much uncertainty, but somehow they had found each other on the other side, and now they were building a new life together. But not everything was as peaceful as it seemed. The ripple effect of Marco's choices, his decision to step away from the family business and reshape his life, hadn't gone unnoticed. His father had made it clear that he was not pleased with Marco's decision to distance himself from the empire. Marco had expected this, of course. His father's voice was still a constant presence in his mind, urging him to return to the life he had built. The demands had been subtle at first, a few more phone calls, a few more meetings arranged, but Marco had refused. He was no longer the obedient son who had done everything to please his family. He was a man choosing his own path. Then, one evening, after Marco had returned home from a long day of meetings with potential business partners who shared his new vision for the future, he received an unexpected call. It was his father. "Marco," his father's stern voice came through the phone. "We need to talk." "I've told you, father," Marco replied, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not going back to the business. I've made my decision." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then his father spoke again, his voice colder than before. "You think you can just throw away everything we've built? Do you think you can simply walk away from your responsibilities?" Marco felt his pulse quicken, but he stood his ground. "It's not about throwing anything away. It's about choosing a life that's true to who I am. I'm not going to live a lie just to please you." His father's voice hardened. "You'll regret this. You're turning your back on everything we've worked for. I don't think you understand the consequences of your actions." Marco's chest tightened, but he didn't back down. "I understand perfectly. I'm doing this for myself, not for anyone else. I don't expect you to understand, but I'm not changing my mind." The conversation ended with a cold, final silence. Marco stood there holding the phone in his hand, his heart pounding. He knew this moment was inevitable. He had anticipated his father's reaction, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. Despite the progress he had made, despite the clarity he felt in his own decisions, there was a part of him that still craved his father's approval. Clara had been sitting in the other room, working on a project she had been passionate about for months. When Marco entered, she saw the look in his eyes. Something had shifted. She knew the call had been difficult. "Marco," Clara said gently, walking over to him. "What happened?" Marco took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. "He's not happy. He wants me back in the business. He wants me to be the son he's always wanted. But I've made my choice, Clara, and I'm not going back, no matter how hard it is." Clara took his hand, leading him to the couch. "You don't have to prove anything to him. You're not his. A son for the empire. You're his son for who you are, not what you've done, and you've already proven that by choosing yourself." Marco nodded, the weight of his father's words still heavy on his chest. "It's hard, Clara. I wish he could see that I'm not abandoning him. I'm just trying to live my life on my own terms." Clara sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "You're doing the right thing. It's not easy, but you have to do what's best for you. The rest will fall into place." In that moment, Marco knew she was right. It wouldn't be easy to let go of his past, but he had already started the process. And no matter what happened next, he was no longer bound by the chains of his family's expectations. He was free. The days following Marco's confrontation with his father were filled with quiet tension. Though Marco had made his decision to break away from his family's expectations, the repercussions of his choices weren't something he could easily escape. Despite his resolve, there were moments when doubt crept in, when he found himself wondering if he had done the right thing. His father's words still lingered in his mind, like a shadow that wouldn't fade. But Clara was there, offering him the support he needed, even when he wasn't sure how to navigate the emotional storms inside of him. She had always been his anchor, the constant force that reminded him of what truly mattered. And while Marco still grappled with his past, he began to realize more and more how essential it was for him to carve out his own future, one built on his own terms, without the pressure of legacy and expectation hanging over him. It wasn't just the family pressure that weighed on him. It was the uncertainty of what came next. He had left behind a world of certainty, a world where every move he made was part of a well-planned strategy. Now, everything felt like uncharted waters. He was stepping into a future where he had no clear path, no blueprint. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. One afternoon, Marco stood by the window in their apartment, staring out at the city below. The streets were alive with movement, but from his vantage point, it felt like the world was both close and distant. The quiet of the room seemed to mirror the stillness inside him. He knew he was standing at the edge of something new, but he wasn't sure how to take the first step. Clara walked in, sensing his tension. "You've been quiet lately," she said gently, stepping up behind him. "What's on your mind?" Marco turned to her, his eyes searching hers, trying to find the words. "I don't know what's next, Clara. I left everything behind. My father's legacy, the business, the life I knew. And now, I don't know what to do with myself." Clara placed a hand on his shoulder, offering him a reassuring squeeze. "It's okay not to have all the answers. You don't have to figure it all out right now." "I want to," Marco said, his voice a little more urgent. "I want to know what the future holds. I want to make something meaningful, but every time I think I'm getting somewhere, I feel like I'm taking a step back. It's like I'm stuck." Clara smiled softly, her eyes full of understanding. "The future isn't something you can control. It's not a road with clear signs telling you where to go, but that's what makes it worth it, because you get to create it as you go. You don't need all the answers right now. What matters is that you're moving forward, not staying stuck in the past." Marco looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had come to rely on her wisdom, on the quiet confidence she exuded, even in the face of uncertainty. "I don't know if I can do this without knowing what's next." "You don't have to know," Clara said, her voice steady. "You just have to trust yourself. You've made it this far. You've already built something real by choosing to live for yourself. And whatever happens, I'll be here. We'll figure it out together." There was a deep quiet in the room, a silence that held everything they had been through in its weight. Marco realized that Clara had been his steady guide through every phase of his transformation. She had given him the space to fall apart and the strength to rebuild, never expecting anything in return but his happiness. And as much as he still struggled with the idea of a future without the safety net of his father's expectations, he knew now that he didn't have to face it alone. "You're right," Marco said, his voice quieter now. "I don't have all the answers, but I don't need to. I just need to start somewhere and trust that the rest will come." Clara smiled and stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him. "Exactly. One step at a time." It wasn't an easy path ahead. Marco knew there would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, but with Clara by his side, he had something solid to hold on to. They were building their own story now, one that wasn't defined by the past, but by their choices and the love they had for each other. Later that evening, Marco found himself sitting at a small table in a local cafe with Clara, surrounded by the warmth of the bustling city. It wasn't the luxury of his past life, but there was something comforting about the simplicity of it. The world outside felt vast, filled with possibilities he hadn't considered before. He looked across the table at Clara, and for the first time in a long while, he felt certain about one thing. The future wasn't as daunting as he had thought. "You know," Marco said, taking a sip of his coffee, "I've been so focused on what I left behind, I never really stopped to think about what I want to create. Maybe it's time I start asking myself that question." Clara nodded, her smile warm. "Exactly. You don't need to know all the answers. You just need to figure out what makes you happy, what makes you feel alive." Marco smiled, the weight on his chest feeling just a little bit lighter. He didn't have to carry the burden of his family's legacy anymore. He didn't have to fit into the mold that had been carved out for him. He could create something entirely his own. And the best part was, he wasn't doing it alone. Clara reached across the table and took his hand in hers, her touch grounding him. "Whatever you decide, Marco, I'm with you. We'll take it one step at a time, and we'll build something real, together." In that moment, Marco finally allowed himself to believe it, that the future wasn't just something to fear, but something to embrace. He had the chance to build a life that reflected who he truly was, not who others wanted him to be. And with Clara by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. It was a crisp morning when Marco finally stepped out of the shadow of his past. The weight of years of decisions, of expectations, of family pressures had been a burden he had carried for so long. But now, as he walked beside Clara through the park, he realized how far he had come. His heart was lighter, his mind clearer. The man who had once been consumed by the drive for success, for approval, was now embracing a life that was his own, and Clara had been the guiding force in that transformation. The park was alive with the soft sounds of early morning, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the wind, the faint hum of the city in the distance. Marco and Clara walked slowly, side by side, with no destination in mind, just enjoying the peace of the moment. For the first time in what felt like forever, Marco felt truly present. He was no longer a man stuck between the past and the future. He was simply living in the now. "I never thought I'd find peace like this," Marco said, his voice soft but full of emotion. "It's like everything I thought I needed to be happy. I was chasing the wrong things." Clara smiled at him, her eyes warm, understanding. "Sometimes it takes losing everything to realize what truly matters. You didn't need any of that. You just needed to be yourself." Marco's gaze softened as he looked at her, his heart full of gratitude. "I've always been afraid to let go of what I knew, afraid of what might happen if I didn't live up to everyone's expectations. But now, with you here, I realize I was never truly living." Clara's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his. "You're living now, Marco. You've made the most important choice of your life, to choose yourself, to choose a life that's yours, not anyone else's. That's all that matters." As they walked, the park seemed to embrace them, a symbol of the new life Marco was beginning to build. The world around them seemed brighter, as if the universe was welcoming him into this new chapter with open arms. There was no pressure, no looming deadlines or family expectations. There was only the here and now. But even as Marco savored the peace of the moment, he couldn't help but feel the pull of the unknown. The future was still uncertain, and he knew that he had many challenges ahead. There would be moments of doubt, moments when the past would try to creep back in, but for the first time, he felt prepared to face whatever came next. "Clara," Marco said, his voice low and serious, "I don't know what tomorrow holds, but I know that with you, I can face it. I don't need the empire. I don't need the approval of my father or anyone else. I just need this. I need us." Clara's heart swelled at his words. For so long, she had been his caretaker, his quiet support, but now she was his partner in every sense of the word. "We'll figure it out, Marco. Together. Whatever happens, we'll make it work. We'll build a life that's ours." As they continued their walk, Marco realized something. He had already started building that life. It wasn't about the business deals, the family name, or the millions in the bank. It was about the moments he shared with Clara, the simple joys of living without the weight of others' expectations. It was about choosing to be authentic, to live true to himself, and to share that journey with someone who loved him for who he was, not for what he could provide. "Do you ever wonder," Marco said thoughtfully, "what life would have been like if I had made this choice sooner? If I hadn't been so caught up in the need to prove myself?" Clara laughed softly, squeezing his hand. "I don't think it matters, Marco. You made the choice when you were ready. You're here now, and that's what matters. We can't change the past. We can only create the future." Marco nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. He didn't need to go back. He didn't need to fix the mistakes of his past. All he needed to do was move forward, step by step, with Clara by his side. The road ahead wasn't always going to be easy, but it was theirs to walk together. As they reached a bench in the park, Marco sat down and pulled Clara gently beside him. He wrapped his arm around her, and together they looked out at the world before them, the world that was no longer full of expectations and demands, but of possibilities and choices. "I think I'm finally ready," Marco said, his voice steady, "ready to build something real, to live for myself, to live for us." Clara rested her head on his shoulder, her heart full of warmth. "We've already built something real, Marco. It's the love we share, the life we're creating, that's all that matters." And in that moment, Marco knew that everything had changed. He had let go of the past, and in doing so, he had found his future, a future where he wasn't defined by what others wanted, but by what he and Clara could create together. They sat there in silence, watching the world unfold around them. The park, the city, the people, all of it seemed to shimmer with the promise of tomorrow. And Marco realized that for the first time, he was truly free.